And I thought that Venom from Marvel Rivals was thick, cause God! Alright, so here's the deal. Apart from Agent Venom, which had very distinct qualities that made me go, yep, that's a definitive pickup, this was the next one that was very much a very contentious one for me personally, strictly personally. Because despite the very large amount of glazing that the Marvel guys were doing, the three guys, Dan, Dwight, and Ryan, were doing towards this particular model, because they were saying that some of the tooling and the quality behind the body was brand new, even though I can blatantly see that it's just the same body they've been using. But despite how inflated the Hasbro guys sounded when they were showing this guy off, I thought to myself, wow, I find myself in a very interesting position, because I go on record quite a handful of times that I'm not the biggest fan of Spider-Man Unlimited. I didn't really like the approach and the tone, and most specifically the background and the story, and exactly where we are at as far as dimensions, as far as that version of New York City or wherever it was, the manimals, you know, the animal-human hybrids and their take on Vulture, all these other characters, the two symbiotes, the Carnage and Venom that have the very quirky designs. I really had a huge disenfranchising with that series, especially coming off the heels of the 94 series. But one thing that I won't take away from Spider-Man Unlimited is that there's a level of cleanliness, a level of edge, a level of style to that particular suit that Spidey boasts in that show. Again, not the biggest fan of the cape that they often give him or Miguel O'Hara, but at least in terms of synchronicity with the suit, the way that they just designed the emblems and then the color scheming that he had going on, the palette, was actually pretty pleasant to the eye and quintessential Spidey. So to see it kind of brought to life somewhat in a 6-inch format here, despite, again, reutilization of a bug that we've seen plenty of times before, I thought to myself, can they do something to at least make it feel pretty premium in hand, very handy? Very well tooled. Because frankly, as I played around with the figure and kind of toyed around with the articulation and the actual quality behind the tooling, I can see nuggets of potential for this figure, because they utilized a really great color palette, a great contrast of hues with the specific blue and the red, because frankly, you know me, I'm a sucker for these like muted tones, despite the classic Spidey having a much more saturated and bright palette as far as the baby blue and the bright red. When it comes to Spider-Man Unlimited, it's supposed to be taking place in a much darker version of our universe or the future, etc. So I like that they fashioned it not only inside of the animated series itself, but also the Hasbro Marvel Legends here that is part of the retro card line. Pretty followed suit as far as the actual blue that's encompassing the majority of the figure, and the red, the maroonish hot rod red that's encompassing pretty much all the different little areas around the thighs, and specifically every part of the symbol, which not only can you see kind of embossed right there at the front, but also on the back underneath that, of course, the cape that I'm not the biggest fan of. But when it comes to actually taking the legs and kind of stretching it about to give it, like I said, that futuristic look, not only are the pieces actually sculpted onto the figure, you can actually feel the spider symbol, the lining, the texture work, but the actual, like I said, clash of colors marry very, very well. I just love looking at, they're very pleasant to the eye as far as the way that they were able to fuse the colors together and then utilize it in a way that really befits the sculpting on top of the lining, as far as the ones that you see kind of curving around the shoulder area, the biceps specifically around the shoulders, the front symbol, and then if you take a little look under the hood, or specifically under the web cape, you can see a much smaller symbol right there that is still sculpted in. They didn't really have to do that. If anything, this is probably the only area that maybe I would give credit to Marvel Legends over McFarlane Toys, because ever so often McFarlane, they kind of cheap out a little bit when you have the detail going on the back. I'm going to be completely fair across the board. Sometimes McFarlane cheapens out a little bit when it comes to texture work or paint applications when it comes to the back of the figure, because he feels that putting a cape covers it up. But he kind of forgets that we can move the cape and see some of those blemishes, some of those imperfections. You know, there's no we can still see the wizard behind the curtain, so to speak. So Marvel Legends actually kind of negated that by making sure that you still got a good amount of texture work happening, not only with the spider symbol here on the back, but even a little bit of creasing for the suit itself, not only on the thighs, but even on the side of the obliques right here, that is still bringing the suit to life, despite, like I said, the overabundance of musculature on the thighs that is very indicative of this specific Vulcan slash Sunfire mold. Like I said, I've lost count which one is which. But then we have further details that are very specific to this buck, as far as these little lines on the back of the calves that are sculpted and painted into the body itself that we haven't really seen before. So it's not just a simple repaint. I can actually feel like they added stuff to it. And on top of that, it feels pretty solid in hand. Now, I understand that this is not going to be necessarily 100% perfect across the board, because I have heard of some people, Toy Shiz in particular, over on social media, specifically Instagram, did note, and I think it was some other people then relayed the information to him, who then kind of echoed it on his social media platforms via stories, etc., that this particular guy does have a few units out there, a few batches that did have a little bit of QC problems when it comes to the specific painting of these lines that are sculpted onto the figure, and a little bit of misalignment happening with them. Now, from what I can tell, I don't see too much of that happening. You can maybe argue a little bit of that with these little ridges that are sculpted on the back of the calves, but at the same time, it doesn't look misaligned. It just looks like they overpainted. So it's kind of bleeding, but it's bleeding on both sides, you know what I'm saying? So it doesn't look misaligned or skewed or like they missed the mark. It still looks like it's centered, but maybe a little bit of the red paint was starting to seep on through. But I have seen some cases in terms of photos, and even firsthand when I picked this guy up, I saw 2 other units up on the peg, and I did see a little bit of misalignment on one of these symbols around this area, around the left pec right here. So I wouldn't put it past them that there's a couple of units out there with some major QC problems. And if I was to find out one here on my particular figure, it would actually be on the head sculpt, which is a rather unique head sculpt. It's a bit more spherical than your traditional Spidey. It's not as egg-headed or oval-like, but I really love the sculpting behind the eyes and the matte finish of the red that is kind of encasing and kind of painted upon the entirety of the head sculpt itself. I don't know what it is, but there's something simplistic about it, but very stylized and very akin to the Unlimited Spider-Man version. The only thing I noticed, though, is that if you look a little carefully, this specific version of white, it's almost like a beigey white that was used for the lenses, which for the most part is pretty solid, is starting to just kind of bleed past the sculpted lenses and into the head by like a fraction of a millimeter. But at that point, like I said, I'm virtually nitpicking at that level. So everything else is sculpted and painted pretty accurately, and that even goes for the cape. Yeah, despite not liking the cape from a design standpoint, the cape that they actually sculpted and glued onto the figure itself is no slouch. It's actually a pretty solid piece with decent webbing sculpted into it. I don't know what it is, but it doesn't feel flimsy. It feels pretty stagnant there. Granted, there's a part of me that wishes that it was a removable accessory beyond being just glued on into the top via a tab here at the part of the head or the neck piece and shoulder piece. But still, at least if you're going to be including one in there, make sure that it's stylized and sculpted very accurately and very well quality. And that's another thing, is that the quality of the plastic itself, despite reutilizing a body that we've seen plenty of times before, at least it feels pretty solid, especially when you start moving the joints about. Head is on a typical ball joint via the hinge there at the neck, so it's definitely able to rotate 360 and look up and down pretty sporadically, but unfortunately not much in the way of tilting because of the way that the hole from the inside of the head is sculpted. It kind of conflicts with the neck. I still wish that Marvel Legends would invest in kind of getting rid of the hinge, but having a dumbbell joint. That way on one end and on the other, you still have the same ball joint. But of course, that's going to require an extra little bit of space. And I think in doing so, the science of this whole entire buck that they've been kind of fiending on is probably going to break. And they're not going to be able to utilize it. They're going to have to retool the entire thing. So obviously, that's going to be quite cost effective. But at least from that point forward, we will move on to probably the next bunch of joints, the next bundle, that right off the bat I can feel and really feel pretty pleased with it. I don't know what it is, because we've seen this joint many times, but the actual quality behind the tooling is pretty top notch. It's actually the shoulder joints, because despite still having the traditional ball joint that's able to rotate 360 and the hinge inside that's able to extend almost at the 180 degree, it doesn't really stop too shy, so it stops just at the 180 degree. And then baked inside the shoulder, you can definitely see the piece that allows the butterfly joint to flex forward and backward. It feels pretty fluid. I can't really describe it very well, but it feels really good in hand. It doesn't feel overly stiff, but also not too overly loose. It feels very buttery smooth, and it flexes in certain degrees and directions that I haven't seen recent Marvel Legends do very well. Like if anything, the recent Secret Wars Spidey, that one felt a little on the stiff side when it came to the butterfly joints. Like they were there, but they weren't moving as flexibly and as smoothly via its hinge or its joint as well as this one does right here. So I don't know what kind of science or voodoo they happen to make work with the unlimited Spidey here, but flexing the butterfly joints is probably one of the more pleasing things to do when it comes to this figure. And as far as moving that joint about and being able to pose it utilizing the butterfly joints, it's one of my favorite things to do and kind of flex them on both. It's not just one, both of them move very intuitively and smoothly and have a great range of motion. So my compliments to the tooling for that. As far as the bicep joints, they're pretty standard, being able to rotate 360 right there. The two joints at the elbows are fully able to bend up. And then you technically do have wrist joints right there that are pretty much tooled and kind of designed the exact same way as your typical wrist joints. However, because of the way that the gauntlet with the little spikes is sculpted and kind of wrapped around the wrist joints, you're going to have to move them in synchronicity with each other in terms of rotation. And bending the hinge on the inside of the wrist is a little problematic due to the way that this piece right here that is technically loose and separated and could be removed, but we'll demonstrate it a little further down the line because I do have some things to say about that. It can technically be removed, and that will allow further movement of the wrist to allow the hand to move inwards and outwards, but just keep in mind that there is a specific problem here to just unlimited Spidey because of the way that this gauntlet piece is designed. Now, when it comes to the torso, it's where we get very, very, very straightforward and, for my money, a little limited due to the way that this model is designed, because he's got the upside down hinge joint for the mid torso as opposed to the typical ball joint that allows rotation. So you're only going to really be able to crunch his torso at the midway point inwards and outwards about that far. And of course, when it comes to extending and flexing towards the back, it becomes a little limited via the cape. Because of the cape being here in place, you're not going to be able to extend it towards the back as far as some other Spidey figures. If anything, you kind of come into conflict with the cape to the point where it might deter and rip away from its adhesive point right here with the tab. However, if you want rotation, you're going to have to rely on the waist cut that you have completely horizontally right about right there. So you can see that you're a little bit on the limited side and very stagnant point when it comes to any kind of torso articulation. However, we go back to roots when it comes to the top leg joints that are able to flex forward about that far, right about right there. Extension towards the back, despite the GAT sculpting, you can extend only about that far back. And then, of course, extension towards the sides stops just shy of the 180-degree angle because of the way that this whole piece is designed. However, right underneath that, you can definitely see thigh swivels, though I personally would have liked them a little lower, but they could still be found right there to reveal a little bit of the glossy red paint from the inside and still allow you to pivot right about right there. Two knee joints right there that are pretty standard issue, though again mine is a little bit on the stiff for at least one joint on either one. So when it comes to flexing, it appears it's mostly the top one, but once you give them a little bit of a firm press, they're both able to bend fully all the way up. And then if you require a little bit more stability, you still got the calf shin swivel that allows the lower part of the leg to be able to rotate just above the sculpted piece that's part of the calf right there. And then, of course, you're going to have the ankle joint, though the ankles are actually much like the butterfly joints that feel pretty intuitive and smooth, but also not too loose. They kind of did the same thing when it comes to the tooling of the ankle. It feels actually pretty good in hand, despite still not being the biggest fan of its overall design. I actually like the mobility and the feel of moving the joints. It doesn't feel, like I said, sticky or stubborn. You can bend the ankle downwards and upwards as usual and pivot them inwards and outwards via the way that that's overall designed. And if you require more rotation, you can rely on the swivels on either the thigh or the calf for that. So I'm fully aware of the irony that this is Spider-Man Unlimited, and yet he comes with some slightly limited articulation because of the body they decided to utilize. Despite the tooling itself feeling pretty good in hand, you're still dealing with an awful lot of those joints that, specifically around the torso area, that I really wish that we could have that top mid-torso ball joint that allows the swiveling, the crunching, and the oblique bending to happen, and then the hinge being at the waist. So I kind of wish that things were a little bit inverted there. And also we can maybe get more experimental with the hand accessories, because quite honestly, yeah, It's the thing that I started to feel once again when it comes to that $24.99 price tag when it comes to some of these retro carded Spideys, because we get yet again the same pair of hand accessories. By default, he's got the fisted hands. Then, of course, on the side, you're going to have the wall crawling extending hands and the web shooters. We're pretty much dealing with the same copy and paste accessories. There's a part of me that still wishes that they could have added. I know that this is factually incorrect. I'm thinking about $20.99 Miguel O'Hara, but there's a part of me that I wish that they would have added maybe a little bit of clawing kind of gesture to the hands, or at least something on top of the palms or on top of the knuckles here to just kind of distinguish them a little bit, because apart from the color hue being replicated with the blue that's on his body, they're the exact same hands. And then to add insult to injury, remember these wrist guard things that he's got going on by design that I was kind of mentioning and sort of nitpicking when it came to the articulation for the wrists themselves? Well, they become a little problematic when it comes to swapping them out, because you're gonna want to pretty much remove them along with the hand when swapping the hands, because they are made out of a slightly bendable plastic that could be a little problematic when it comes to continuous wear and tear during the swappable process. So you can see right here that even some of the front legs that are kind of designed to mimic that look of a spider, which from a design standpoint, they look cool, and I like the red shading, but I know that from a functionality standpoint, these things have almost built in a recipe to rip and tear if we are to be swapping these hands very, very frequently. I'm going to try to keep it at a minimum, but at the same time, I could see your average collector want to be able to pre-pose this character a set amount of times, and over time, by some chance, if they're doing it rather quickly, these things could easily rip and tear. So just be careful with that. So just to demonstrate as one more example here, I'm going to remove this one. And yeah, I feel just a little nervous pulling any of these hand accessories out, knowing that by default, this wrist piece is going to come off. And yeah, it's bendable. It's not super rigid, but I still feel like, you know, it's just one step away from causing some kind of tear and fracturing that little piece, especially the wristband that kind of coils itself around the actual point of connection for the wrist and the hand accessory itself. So on top of wanting some much more unique accessories or unique hand accessories that can make this whole process a little bit more worthwhile, you're still dealing with these wrist pieces that I kind of wish were just not as nervous inducing or scary inducing. And then on top of that, the option to want to have that cape to be removable for design purposes. But outside of that, again, I'm not lying when I said that there's at least nuggets of potential for this figure to have been great. Now, granted, I still wish, as I've said numerous times to the point of becoming a bit of a broken record, still wish that Marvel Legends will at least take some chances, take some risks of utilizing a completely different body. Not necessarily one that's completely brand new from the ground up, but maybe one that we haven't seen for a really long time, to utilize it for a character like Spider-Man Unlimited. I think this could have been a worthwhile opportunity, but on the bright side, there's enough sculpting and tooling detail as far as the way that the articulation feels, despite the points themselves not being ultra varied, to then the little pieces that were sculpted on top of the body to give it an added level of detail and almost freshness to how the symbols protrude and are embossed, the little details on the calves, a way to make the suit this kind of addition to the collection that feels worthwhile, that kind of captures your eyes a little bit. And that's coming from someone who's not the biggest fan of Spider-Man Unlimited, but at least I can say that the design for the character is cool, and the Marvel Legends was at least able to move me enough to pick this guy up. Plus some brownie points for the GAD that Hasbro managed to sculpt on him, awarding him a 7 out of 10 for my personal liking. And from what I can tell, this guy is slowly starting to trickle out to massive amount of targets across the country. It looks like more and more people are frequently finding them, despite the initial release date of late February, early March. So if you guys happen to come across him, I actually do kind of recommend him. I just feel like there's probably some other figures or additions to this wave that are a little bit more on the unique side, from Agent Venom to even Chameleon with that J. Jonah Jameson mask. There's some things in there that I look at and go, okay, if we can maybe start to, again, take some chances. I feel like that's the secret weapon that Marvel Legends could probably extrapolate. And it looks like maybe we could be vying for that direction with this brand new Maximum series, but it's almost like at this point we're treating action figures like we're doing video game consoles within the video game space as far as what am I getting for the price. Pricing is everything, and full transparency with the customer is everything. So if there's a specific suit that Spider-Man has donned at some point in either the comics or in this case at the animated series, what's a version of Spidey that you would like to see the Marvel Legends guys finally tackle? Whether it be with this specific mold that they've utilized time and time again, or you would want them to at least build a brand new mold for. According to them, it looks like maybe that's what they're doing with the Maximum series, where they're trying to indirectly and not outright say that they're tackling the Todd McFarlane design with a brand new mold, but at the same time they're kind of tiptoeing or dancing around those details and that notion. But I would like to accept the fact that that is a very Todd McFarlane-y kind of look. But again, pricing is ultimately really going to decide whether or not this is something that I really want to speak with my wallet for. What do you guys think would be that ultimate figure that you look at and go, yeah, this is a very deep cut of a Spidey, but I will speak with my wallet with this one. I'm looking forward to what you guys have to say down in the comments, and while you guys are down there, hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video, thumbs down if you did not, and as always, stay humble and take care.